Before the crimes, there was the image. Before the violence, there was the performance. Bundy's first advantage was not force, it was trust. Ted Bundy's danger was never obvious, kind of the point. He looked intelligent, trustworthy, even reassuring, the kind of man people remembered as helpful, not harmful. He was not dangerous because he was loud or erratic. He was dangerous because he was convincing. He understood how to project familiarity, how to make people feel safe, and how to use that trust as a weapon. What followed was not impulse, but control. Not chaos, but calculation. And that is what made him one of the most disturbing serial offenders in American history. Picture this, a man in a packed courtroom, articulate and composed. He smiles, he gestures, he argues with the practiced confidence of someone who believes he can out-talk consequence itself. He looks for all the world like an innocent man fighting for his life. Now remove the performance. What remains is a predator. A man who hunted, kidnapped, and murdered young women and girls. A man who returned to some of their bodies after death in acts of post-mortem violation that were driven less by desire than by possession. He was also a law student, a political activist, and a crisis hotline volunteer. The contradiction is the point. Evil does not always arrive looking like a crisis. Sometimes it arrives looking organized. To understand how that performance began, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the murders, but to the family lie that shaped the boy behind the mask. Theodore Robert Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, at a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried, and in the social climate of the time, that carried a heavy stigma. To hide the circumstances of his birth, the family constructed a lie. For the first years of his life, Bundy was raised by his grandparents and told they were his parents. His biological mother was presented to him as his older sister. That kind of deception does not disappear quietly. It teaches a child that identity is negotiable and truth is elastic. It also installs a basic lesson early. The people closest to you may not tell you what is real. The family secret eventually came apart. The details vary, but the result was the same. Bundy learned that the life he had been given was built on falsehood. That revelation mattered because it did not simply create confusion, it created grievance. He internalized the deception as betrayal, and the resentment never really left. In 1950, Louise moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where she later married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who adopted Ted and gave him the surname that would become notorious. The household, however, did not resolve the instability. Bundy's relationship with his stepfather was strained from the start. He reportedly viewed Johnny as intellectually and socially inferior, and he was ashamed of his working-class status. Even as a child, Bundy seemed to measure himself against hierarchy. He wanted rank, admiration, and distinction. If he could not earn it directly, he would construct it. Outwardly, though, he maintained the appearance of a normal boy. He delivered newspapers, mowed lawns, and participated in youth activities at church. He could appear polite and helpful. In one account, he even saved a young child from drowning. To neighbors and acquaintances, he looked ordinary enough. But ordinary was always a performance. Long before the murders, there were signs that his inner life was not developing in a healthy direction. A relative later recalled waking up to find kitchen knives arranged around her, while a young Ted stood nearby smiling. He was also said to have built punji traps in the woods, sharp concealment devices that injured at least one other child. These were not random childhood quirks. They were early expressions of aggression, control, and an emerging pleasure in creating fear. Clinically, those behaviors fit the pattern psychologists associate with conduct disorder: repeated violation of rules, lack of remorse, and disregard for the safety of others. Not every child with conduct problems becomes a violent offender, but in Bundy's case, the pattern appears to have been an early signal of a far deeper deficit, one involving empathy, restraint, and ordinary human inhibition. This is where rejection hardens into grievance. Adolescence did not soften him, It sharpened his insecurity. Bundy later claimed he preferred isolation because he had trouble understanding social interaction. Others remembered him as shy, awkward, and vulnerable to humiliation. Whatever version of events one accepts, the result was the same. He experienced himself as excluded, and exclusion hardened into resentment. He did not seem to absorb rejection, he cataloged it. Then came the relationship that would become central to his psychological development. Diane Edwards, known in some accounts as Stephanie Brooks. She was everything Bundy wanted to become. She came from wealth, carried herself with confidence, and seemed to belong naturally to a world of ease and status. He was drawn to her, not only as a girlfriend, but as a symbol. She represented the life he believed he had missed. Their relationship was unstable from the start. Bundy felt inferior, and that inferiority made him both needy and controlling. In 1968, Edwards ended the relationship. For Bundy, that was not a normal breakup. It was an injury to the self, a narcissus wound, a rejection from the person who embodied the future he wanted. He later admitted that he was consumed by revenge fantasies. That admission matters because it reveals the structure underneath the story. Humiliation was not processed and released. It was preserved, reshaped, and returned as motive. After the breakup, Bundy did not collapse. He adapted. He dropped out of college, then returned. He changed his major to psychology. He began building a new identity, confident, disciplined, ambitious, and increasingly polished. He entered Republican politics, associated with influential people, and learned how to present himself as capable and controlled. The transformation looked like growth. In reality, it was reinvention through performance. During this period, he also began a long-term relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer, who would remain attached to him throughout much of his killing career, unaware of what he was doing elsewhere. Bundy's private and public lives diverged sharply, and that division became part of his method. He could be intimate, detached, and deceptive at the same time. That is not a contradiction in his case. That is the design. In 1973, Bundy reconnected with Edwards. By then, he had become exactly the kind of man she once wanted him to be. He was older, more polished, and better able to simulate confidence. They resumed their relationship, and he let her believe marriage might follow. Then, in January 1974, he withdrew. He ghosted her. When she finally confronted him, his response was flat, evasive, and cold. He later described the point of the entire exercise with brutal simplicity. He wanted to prove to himself that he could have married her. That line explains more than romance. It explains control. The goal was not love, it was restoration of status through humiliation. He did not need her affection. He needed to demonstrate mastery over the rejection that had marked him. He had turned a private grievance into a rehearsed psychological reversal. Around the same time, young women in the Pacific Northwest began disappearing. Bundy's work at a Seattle suicide crisis hotline is one of the most chilling details in the record. There, he spent hours speaking in a tone of manufactured empathy to people in crisis. The irony is severe. The same man who was learning how to comfort strangers was also learning how to study vulnerability. He was not practicing compassion, he was practicing access. He was studying the language of trust, because trust was the key to everything. Bundy was not crazy, in the sense people often mean. He was not a hallucinating or disorganized offender detached from reality. What made him dangerous was far more structured, a personality organized around manipulation, entitlement, and control. In broad clinical terms, his behavior aligns with traits commonly associated with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Psychopathy offers one useful lens. Dr. Robert Hare's work on the psychopathy checklist describes a pattern that includes superficial charm, grandiosity, shallow affect, and a lack of empathy. Bundy fits that pattern with unsettling consistency. He was articulate, polished, and easy to underestimate. He could make himself appear warm, intelligent, and approachable. That charm was not a feature of his personality, it was an instrument. His grandiosity was equally central. Bundy appears to have believed he was smarter than the people around him and clever enough to outmaneuver investigators, prosecutors, and the legal system itself. Other people were not equals in his mind. They were objects to be assessed, exploited, and discarded. The most disturbing element is the absence of empathy and remorse. Bundy did not experience the suffering of others as a constraint. Their pain did not stop him because it did not register as morally binding. That emotional emptiness gave him room to commit extreme violence without the internal resistance that restrains ordinary people. Narcissism added another layer. Narcissistic personality disorder is marked by a need for admiration, a fragile self-image, and an intense reaction to criticism or rejection. Bundy needed to be exceptional. He needed to believe he was admired, superior, and untouchable. Rejection did not merely disappoint him, it threatened his self-concept. That is why humiliation could become fuel. This also shaped his courtroom behavior. When Bundy chose to represent himself, it was not a practical legal strategy. It was a stage performance. The courtroom gave him an audience, and he behaved accordingly. He wanted to be seen as the smartest man in the room, the man who could perform competence under pressure and turn prosecution into theater. That is where the common idea of a dual personality breaks down. Bundy did not have two separate selves in the clinical sense. He was not living with a split identity. What he had was a highly functional performance of normalcy. Psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley described this kind of pattern in a person who appears composed, intelligent, and socially intact while concealing a profound moral and emotional deficit. That is the better frame for Bundy. He was not divided, he was hidden. The charming law student, the articulate public figure, the helpful volunteer, those were not alternate personalities, they were cover. The mask did not conceal a second person, it concealed the first one. Beneath the performance was fantasy. Bundy's inner world appears to have been driven by power, domination, and possession. The early signs of voyeurism and violent sexual fantasy suggest that these impulses were being rehearsed long before the murders began. Over time, the fantasies deepened. He did not simply imagine control, he needed to enact it. The murders were not random eruptions. They were the physical completion of private obsession. That is the psychological intersection that matters most. The emotional emptiness of psychopathy, the ego injury of narcissism, and the long cultivation of violent fantasy. Together, they produced a man who did not merely commit murder, he constructed it. We've been through a lot of dark territory here. If you appreciate this kind of deep dive into the criminal mind and want to better understand the hidden forces that drive criminal behavior, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We want to know your thoughts. What aspect of Bundy's psychology do you find the most chilling? Was it the mask of sanity, the narcissistic rage, or the complete lack of empathy? Let us know in the comments below. Bundy's method reflected that same structure. His modus operandi was not chaotic. It was organized around manipulation, familiarity, and control. The first step was victim selection. Investigators have long noted a pattern in the appearance of his victims. Often young, attractive women with long dark hair parted in the middle. Bundy denied being drawn to a specific type, but the similarity is difficult to dismiss. Many observers have linked that pattern to Edwards, suggesting that his violence may have carried symbolic weight. Whether conscious or not, the repetition suggests reenactment. He was not just killing women, he was revisiting a wound. The second step was the lure. This is where his understanding of human decency became useful to him. Bundy famously used a fake arm cast or sling, carrying books, asking for help, or appearing to struggle with a car. The point was simple. He turned himself into someone who seemed in need. He knew that people are inclined to help the vulnerable. He exploited that instinct with precision. He also impersonated authority, including police officers. That tactic worked for the same reason. Authority quiets hesitation. It creates false certainty. Bundy understood that people defer when they believe the danger has already been evaluated by someone else. He used that reflex against them. The final phase was the assault itself. Once a victim was isolated and under his control, the performance ended. Violence took over. The killings were brutal, and the aftermath was worse. Bundy later admitted to returning to bodies. He engaged in post-mortem sexual acts, and in some accounts, ritualized the bodies further by washing hair or applying makeup. These acts were not expressions of intimacy. They were the logic of possession extended beyond death. In life, his victims could resist him. In death, they could not. That was the appeal. He also escalated into acts of concealment and mutilation, including decapitation in some cases. The details are grotesque, but the psychology is plain. He wanted total control, total ownership, and total erasure of the victim's agency. That is what his behavior was built around, not sex in any ordinary sense. Dominance. In court, Bundy did not abandon the performance. He brought it with him. The courtroom became one more stage. For years, Bundy moved from state to state while investigators struggled to connect the cases. But grandiosity tends to generate errors. After his arrest in Utah in 1975, he became a suspect in multiple homicides. Facing charges in Colorado, he escaped custody twice. The second escape, in late 1977, gave him one last window. He fled to Florida. In January 1978, he attacked the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. The assault was savage and disorganized, suggesting that his self-control was fraying. He moved through the house in a burst of violence, killing 2 women and severely injuring others. Weeks later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. This final period was more chaotic than his earlier crimes. The polished control was breaking down. In February 1978, a Pensacola police officer stopped him for a routine traffic violation. That traffic stop ended his run. The arrest did not end the performance. It changed its venue. The Florida trials became media spectacles, and Bundy treated them as such. He insisted on representing himself, which gave him the opportunity to turn legal proceedings into personal theater. He cross-examined witnesses, worked the room, and acted like a man who thought intelligence could substitute for evidence. One of the most unsettling moments came during the Chi Omega proceedings, when he forced testimony to revisit the crime scene in detail. His behavior suggested more than legal strategy. It suggested appetite. He was not merely defending himself. He was revisiting the event through the machinery of the trial. He also proposed to Carol Ann Boone while she testified. Bundy exploited a Florida present consent rule. In front of Judge Edward Cowell, they gave the consent needed for the marriage. Because the law recognized that kind of present tense agreement, the wedding was treated as valid. So he was able to stage a legal marriage in open court. Bundy likely learned of the legal opening through his own preparation and close attention to courtroom procedure, then used it to turn marriage into another performance of control. Even now, even in court, he was still trying to control the frame. The evidence, including bite mark analysis from the Chi Omega case, was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to death multiple times. Judge Edward Cowell, in remarks that have remained part of the public memory of the case, acknowledged the tragedy of wasted potential while still imposing sentence. The contrast is what makes the moment endure. Recognition without absolution. Bundy spent the next decade on death row, continuing to delay, deflect, and manipulate. He gave interviews, but even then he often spoke as if the killer were someone else. He preferred distance to responsibility. That was consistent. Accountability was always the thing he refused to inhabit. Only at the end, when execution became imminent, did he begin to confess in fuller detail. He also gave an interview to Dr. James Dobson in which he attempted to shift blame toward violent pornography. That explanation was convenient for him because it preserved the old structure, externalized the cause, minimized the self. It was one more attempt to control the story before the story ended. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair. The case leaves behind more than a body count. It leaves behind a study in how predation can hide inside competence. Bundy was not frightening because he looked broken. He was frightening because he looked functional. He used normality as camouflage, trust as a tool, and charm as access. He did not violate the image of safety from the outside. He wore it from within. Anne Rule, who knew him personally, described him as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure in pain and control. That description survives because it is structurally accurate. Bundy was not simply a man who committed terrible crimes. He was a man who turned other people's trust into a method. That is the most disturbing lesson of the case. Evil is not always loud. Sometimes it is articulate, measured, and oddly polished. Sometimes it smiles at the camera, speaks in complete sentences, and looks like the least suspicious person in the room. And that is why Bundy still unsettles people. Not because he was unreadable, but because he was readable in the wrong direction.